Good afternoon, everybody. This is Steve Wilson at the Illinois State Water Survey, host for the webinar today on what realtors need to know about homes with well water. This is being done jointly with the Water Resources Center at the U of I, and it's supported and funded through the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, which is a national technical assistance and training organization that received funding from US EPA for this program. So we'll get started. There's a lot of questions that have been asked, and we'll run through some of the basic information we want to share with realtors today first, and from that point we'll get to the questions. All right, so a couple things about today's webinar. It's part of a national program, as I mentioned, through RCAP to support private well owners around the country, and one of the ways we do that is by working with some of the stakeholders, realtors, environmental health professionals, labs, and it's all based on the material from the free course that we provide called it's at privatewellclass.org. There are 10 lessons there. I'll talk about that at the end. And we are recording this webinar. And so probably by next Monday, it will be available both on our videos page at privatewellclass.org and our YouTube page. And though we did receive a lot of questions from those of you who registered, and we'll get to a lot of those, we'll also save some time at the end or create extra time to answer any questions that might come up today as you're listening in. So I'm Steve Wilson. I'm a groundwater hydrologist, and I have with me Katie Hollenbeck from the Water Resources Center. She's going to be taking your questions online and putting those all together for us at the end. And also Dan Webb and Chuck Curtis, both are chemists here at the Illinois State Water Survey, who at the end, when we have some chemistry-related questions or water quality-related questions, we defer to those guys who actually understand those issues a lot better than I do. So with that, there's a lot of issues that are important to home buyers and sellers related to having a well. A lot of times people may buy a home with a well and not even realize, what they need to do or what the responsibilities are, understand water quality. They've always lived in a community where their water's been provided and regulated. And so that's what we're going to cover today, is some of those basic issues as well as the questions we have at the end. So as far as a realtor, it's important to make sure they understand what comes with owning a well. Poor construction, a lot of wells, and I mean a lot of wells, were constructed prior to the current well construction regulations in most states, so they may not meet the current well construction guidelines. And even though they're grandfathered in and they may work fine, a lot of times that's not the case. Old hand-dug wells or old bored wells that might be more at risk because of water quality issues near the surface and those sorts of things. As well as for the buyer, it matters for the property value of the property they're buying, being able to maintain that property, what risks they might have for their family, and what are they going to have treatment costs if there's, naturally occurring arsenic or some other contaminant that needs to be dealt with. So the one thing I'm going to outline several times here, and also based on some of the questions I received, if you take our class, it's free. You can go to our webpage and sign up. There's 10 lessons. They're mailed to you as a PDF. It will greatly improve your understanding of wells, how they work, what the issues are related to construction, water quality, source water protection, things a well owner can do to maintain their well better, all those sorts of issues, even issues related to treatment. So I certainly recommend, if you sell to or are the realtor for a buyer related to private wells, which is why I'm assuming you're on this webinar in the first place, it will certainly help you to take our class. So yeah, whether you represent the buyer or the seller, you should do an inspection of the well and the water system. Some states that's required. Test the drinking water. That's also required as part of the inspection in some states, or an inspection may not be required, but testing may be in a few states or counties. But the idea here is you're better off being informed and understanding where everybody sits, buyer and seller, and especially for the buyer. If there aren't requirements and the mortgage, if it's a HUD loan or a VA loan or whatever, and there aren't requirements for testing, test your water anyway and make it a condition of buying the property so that you're informed and assured that you're not buying a property where there may be some contaminant or some issue with the well that needs to be dealt with that might cost a lot of extra dollars, so to speak. So a little bit about basics of wells. There are really three types of wells. There are bored and dug wells, which I'll talk about first, and these are typically in areas where there is not an aquifer. When you do have an aquifer, that's either sand and gravel or it's in bedrock, and I'll talk about those next. But in a lot of places in the country, there is no potable water supply that would be considered an aquifer at a location or at a specific location. And so like a cistern that, is a large tank that's meant to capture rainwater, a dug or bored well is a large diameter well where water can seep in near the surface, typically from the water table, which, in Illinois might be 7 feet. Some places it might be 70 feet. But it's the near surface percolation of water into the soil layer that makes its way into a well. They're large diameter so that they act as storage basins for water. Sometimes water can seep in very slowly. You can look at this picture here. It looks like it's mostly very dark soil, clay, and so water doesn't move through it very fast. But by having that large volume of space, water can slowly seep in so it's available. And here's some examples of bored and dug wells. You can't judge them by what they look like. The one on the lower left could as easily be a sand and gravel well or a bedrock well. In current construction code in Illinois, you put a 6-inch riser from 10 feet below land surface to the surface, and where on the right side, that's construction for a bored well in the past, was a 3-foot concrete tile that went all the way to the surface. And the upper left is an old hand-dug well. This is a well we sampled. This picture is taken by my boss. It's like 6-foot diameter, I think. It's a cattle pasture. The cattle can rub on those posts. There's 2x8s and 2x10s covering it that aren't nailed together, and then some pieces of tin with concrete blocks to keep it all covered. Snakes can get in there, rats can get in there, all kinds of insects and critters. It's on a hill slope, so there's runoff. You can see kind of the mud from the cattle walking through there on the right side. Not necessarily the safest or best situation for a private well. These are two diagrams showing current Illinois construction code. And you can see I mentioned earlier these are 36-inch diameter or 3-foot diameter concrete tile, the idea being that they act as a storage vessel. So water can seep in from these. You can see these thin sand lenses on the diagram that are horizontal between the two wells. And there's two types of construction here, but water seeps in between the precast concrete tile sections. They're not cemented together, they're just laid on top of each other, and so water can seep in. The problem then being that if you don't use a concrete, like in the example on the left, where there's 6 inches of concrete around the well for the upper 10 feet, or a minimum of 10 feet, then you could have material seeping in from just a few feet below land surface, which if you use garden chemicals or you're near a field or in a feedlot, which we do find wells that are right in the middle of a feedlot once in a while, they're more susceptible then to those contaminants getting in the well. And these are by far the most risk as far as the type of well, because they're getting water from fairly shallow near land surface. A sand and gravel well, on the other hand, is a steel casing or PVC casing that at the bottom of the well has woven or PVC screen, like this is a stainless steel screen in the picture. Those slots, there's tiny slots between there that let the water through and keep the sand out. And the issue or the way a sand and gravel well works is water only comes in at the screen. So if you have a 100-foot sand and gravel well and it's got a 4-foot screen at the bottom, then water's coming in from 96 to 100 feet. The rest of the casing is solid. Water doesn't come through that. And so, you're 96 feet from land surface, which is a good thing in that example as far as water seeping in. So they're usually, as I mentioned, PVC or steel. The size of your screen kind of depends on the amount of water you need. A private well may have a 4 or 5-foot screen. A community well may have a 20-foot screen because they're pumping, several hundred gallons a minute, where a private well may be pumping just a few gallons a minute. Here's an example of what that looks like for the whole well and the typical well. The pump's usually submersible. It's down. This is actually a bad example because you wouldn't put the pump down in the screen that usually causes higher velocity in the well, which can cause sand to make its way through. Usually the pump is up above the screen, and a lot of times in a sand and gravel well like this, the water's coming in at, say, 96 feet, but the water level in the well may be up to 40 feet because of pressure in the system or how thick the sand and gravel is. And so you put the pump so that it doesn't go dry whenever you turn it on, but it's usually above the screen. These are the typical features of a well. And the discharge line and the conduit are usually down below the frost line, which is why you have a pitless adapter if you're in a cold area. Yeah, this is pretty standard. This is a bedrock well, very similar in design except for two things. Bedrock is solid rock with fractures. So the water that you get in a bedrock well typically comes from fractures, which is, you've heard the term fracking. That all started and actually still happens with water wells as well as oil and gas wells to try to open up more fractures and allow more water to seep into a well. And what typically happens, and it's not always the case, but the actual casing for the well, the steel or PVC, is seated 10 to 20 feet into the bedrock. So as an example, let's say you have a 400-foot bedrock well, but the bedrock surface is at 60 feet. Then your casing probably goes to 70 or 80 feet total depth from land surface and stops. And the rest of the depth from 80 feet down to 400 is an open hole. It stays open because rock is solid, and that allows you to take advantage of those fractures you might run into as you drill through that material. The more fractures and the more interconnected the fractures, the more water you're likely to have. What this does mean, and you can look at the diagram, the little blue lines are fracture lines, is that water's only coming into the well, or 99% of it's coming into the well from those fractures, not from the rock material itself, where in sand and gravel it's coming in through, it goes through the sand and the space between the sand grains. So what this can mean is with a bedrock well, if you don't have many fractures, you may have a very low yielding well, and I'll talk about that when we get to some of the questions, but also the water may be coming from further away, which means you need to be a little more aware of where the water's coming from, what might be in the area as far as sources of contamination. It shows this fracture going from near the submersible pump up to the upper left. That gets up into the saturated overburden. That could be 100 yards away. It could be half a mile away. And so they can be influenced over larger distances. So it's just something to be aware of. And it's just another reason to always sample a well. So well type does matter. As I mentioned, a dug or bored well really has no real aquifer. And if it's in the case of dug wells, they're very old. Like the example we showed the image of a little while ago, I grew up on an old hand dug well that was 14 feet deep and 4-foot diameter with just uncemented brick. It was in a ravine so that water could flow into it, but it also was a cattle pasture, which means we got runoff into our well from our pasture. Not the best situation. A lot of old hand dug wells are very vulnerable. They're in poor locations, and it was back, most of those were installed at a time where the idea was just to get water. There was an understanding of water quality and all those risks. A drilled or driven well can be in sand and gravel. Sometimes when sand's near the surface and the water levels are very shallow, you can drive a well, a sand point, if you will. Those aren't as safe either because you're getting water from near the surface. And then consolidated rock, bedrock, those are usually drilled at various depths depending on the type of material. So the thing to understand is in some cases you might have choices about what kind of well you drill. I know here in Champaign County in Illinois, we have mostly sand and gravel wells or dug or bored wells, either on an aquifer or you're not. But if you drilled through the 2 or 3 different aquifers that we do have that are sand and gravel, there is potable water in the bedrock below. It's just there's no reason to do that, so nobody does. But your state geological survey, or in Illinois, the state water survey, can help you understand those kind of differences and what kind of options a well owner might have. In fact, that's part of my job, is to help well owners who may buy a property in Illinois understand what their geology might be and what other wells have been drilled in the area, looking at the well logs to understand where their water might be coming from. So for correcting poor construction, if you have an old well on a property, in most states, in most areas, they're all grandfathered in, so they're acceptable and you can still use them today. They may not be protective enough for water quality at the surface, or they may be in a location that allows for contamination, either because there's a septic field or a livestock enclosure or ag chemicals are being applied or a number of other reasons, buried tanks. So it's good to understand what those risks are and how old the well is. If it doesn't have a log, then you can probably assume it's older. That's not always the case. In some states, like Illinois, we passed a law in the 60s that said you had to file a permit and log when you drill a well. In other states, that law might not have been passed until the 80s, or even, and I know in the state of New York, it wasn't until 2000. So the state doesn't have a lot of well records prior to that, and that's a problem if you're trying to understand how deep your well is, what formation your water is coming from, where your screen might be if it's a sand and gravel well, or how it was constructed to understand if it was done properly or not. So one other issue are pits, and especially anywhere where there's frost and freezing in the northern third of the country. A lot of wells in the old days were installed in pits so that they were below the frost line. Today, wells are installed using a pitless adapter, which is just for that reason. You don't have to have a pit and a well in a pit. You know, they can flood, they can harbor critters, and they're a hazard. And not only a hazard for contamination from the surface or if they're not properly maintained, but also a safety hazard. You see a lot of cases where folks may have a board or some kind of protection over the surface that's not adequate. It gets ran over by a tractor, or somebody steps on it, or livestock steps on it, and they fall through and, breaks a leg or does whatever. So the best thing to do if you have a well in a pit is to extend it to the surface and follow the current code in your state if you have that. There are a few states that don't actually have well construction codes, Pennsylvania and Alaska, and in that case, I would recommend following the guidelines from either a nearby state, or if a county has an ordinance, or from the National Groundwater Association and what they recommend. So most issues related to private wells are related to these: poor construction or being an old well. They're not any kind of new issue. We talk about climate change or these emerging pharmaceutical chemicals and some of those things. That's not where the real risk seems to be with most private wells. It's that they aren't up to current code, they're not protective at the surface, and they weren't constructed properly because they're old. And so those basic things are what we're trying to get the message out and across about. Here's two examples. You can see the image on the left came from the Washington State Department of Ecology. They are the agency in Washington State that regulates drillers and well construction. I'm sure this person stepped over that piece of plywood 1,000 times, but you can see this well, even with, if the plywood was still there, there's an opening, there's an old funnel there, there's a broom, what kind of things are getting swept down into that well, and then it's being pulled up through the pump. Just not a very good, safe construction. And this other picture, you can see the water down there, and yeah, these are just examples of poorly constructed wells, or wells that aren't sealed properly at the surface and taken care of. So what should you do? Bring them up to code if there is a code. And I know I'll show an example of in Wisconsin, they have an inspection form that basically follows their current code. No one has to follow it. No one has to make any changes, but at least it points out where deficiencies are. I think that's a good reason to do an inspection in the first place. Have the inspector compare the well construction as it is to what the state code is, point out where things might be a risk and what vulnerabilities there might be. And if you have a well in a pit, extend it to the surface or above the surface so that it's safer, fill it in. And, again, talk to your well authority, your county or contractor, and find out, what they recommend to make your well sealed properly at the surface and safe. Along with that, go abandon wells. So in many areas, there's an old farmstead. They tear it down. They put in a new well and a new home. The old well they decide they're going to leave for irrigating the garden or for some other reason, and eventually everyone forgets that it's there. As I mentioned before, well logs weren't necessarily required to be filed with the state. In some states, they still aren't required until between the 60s and 80s, pretty much. And what we find, even in Illinois, is that there are more undocumented wells than there are wells that we have on file. So the State Water Survey, where I work, is a repository for all the well logs in the state. You file a permit with your county, you file a log with the county, and then all 102 counties in Illinois send those logs to us, and we file them and keep records, and we have a database of all that information, partly so that I can, when a well owner calls, I can look up what we know about the area from the well logs and tell them, what kind of geology they're going to find, maybe what kind of natural water quality might be there, all those sorts of things. I did a study a few years ago where we did a door-to-door inventory of private wells in 9 rural townships. We found 708 wells, or 1,708 wells, and we didn't have logs for 788 of them, so almost half. And in a rural area, we'd expect more of that because a lot of the homes are older than, in a subdivision or on the outskirts of where development's happening. But it points out that even though our law passed in the early 60s, we still don't have a lot of the logs and know where all the wells are. And so some of those wells have been abandoned. They're not in use anymore. They're a real safety hazard. And I'll just show you this as an example. Again, these 2 pictures are from Washington Department of Ecology. They have a blog. There's a horse in a well. There's a man who fell 45 feet in his well, and they're retrieving him. He was lucky enough to survive. But these 4 newspaper clippings, 3 of them are from Illinois, and one is Jessica McClure from Texas. Everybody who's old enough remembers when there was a 18 or 24-hour live CNN feed of them trying to rescue this girl from an 18, well, it wasn't even that big. I think it might have been a 12-inch well. She was 18 months old and fell into, and it took them quite a while to dig her out, basically. But she survived and all that. But not everybody's that lucky. The newspaper clipping at the bottom is from Sangamon County, and she's found dead in an old open well. That's an abandoned well that somebody didn't fill in. If your seller or buyer have property, or your seller has property that has an old well like this, they're liable if somebody gets hurt or if something gets dumped in and it actually contaminates the aquifer. So they need to be sealed, and that's the message here, I guess, is that if you know of an old well, if it's not being used, the best thing to do is to fill it in properly, and there are recommendations on how to do that, both from national organizations like the National Groundwater Association and also, in most states, like from our Illinois Department of Public Health, for example, or in Wisconsin, DNR, or in Michigan, their DEQ. It just depends on what state you're in. So we also recommend that there should be an inspection of the well and the water system. Again, these aren't necessarily required, but it also, if you're the seller, it allows you to be better prepared. I know one of the questions we got, which I thought was funny, was someone didn't ask a question. Well, their question was, why do realtors always wait till the last minute to do an inspection or a water sample, and it delays the closing, basically? And really, if you're thinking about selling a property, that's one of the first things that should be done, is to have an inspection done, have a water sample taken. It takes a while to get the results to find out where you stand, because the buyer may very well require that or insist on it, and it can delay the whole process. And so from that standpoint, it's important to know where you stand. Information's always better, whether some people don't think it is, but it is. And so things can affect property value. That's a fact. I know in New Jersey they require sampling at the sale of a property. The state does the sampling and the analysis. The only people that see the results are the buyer and the seller. But it certainly makes a difference on, whether that water can be drank, some of those things. And so it's better to be informed. I mentioned Wisconsin before. They have a very unique approach to property transfer. This is a form they've developed, and it says that if you're going to do an inspection, it has to be done by a licensed water well contractor, and you have to use this form. But inspections are completely voluntary, and you're not required to do anything to bring it into compliance once you've done the inspection. But this inspection form basically gives whoever is using this information an understanding of what type of well they have, whether it meets current well construction codes, where the deficiencies are, and what might be wrong with the well. So as you can read here, it says, do not send forms to DNR. They're not trying to get in the middle of all this. They just want to make sure that if it's going to be done, it's done correctly, and that the buyer or whoever requested the inspection knows how they stand with their well, basically, versus what current construction code is. So as we go down this, It lists all the non-complying features based on their well construction code and any comments. So at least you can be informed when you buy a property in Wisconsin what things you might, be a hazard. If the casing height is only 6 inches and the minimum is 8 inches, number 21, for instance, not such a big deal necessarily if the area is on a high ground and it's not subject to flooding. But if it's an old dug well and it's got a pit, then you might want to, or it's in a floodway, a floodplain, then you might want to either rethink putting in a new well or what we can do to mitigate that risk. So again, it's just information that allows the buyer to be prepared for what they might be getting into. We had a guy here at the University of Illinois who came from New York City, bought a property in the country. He was several months into living out there before he started realizing what his responsibilities were as a well owner, and had a ton of questions. And, I blame not only him for not being informed, but also whoever sold him the home for not making sure that he was aware that buying a well which had a bored well, what risks there might be and what responsibilities they might have and why they need to test and all those things. This is just an example from Minnesota, from their well construction code, and it lists setback distances. Most states have these sorts of diagrams or at least information, and I show this because it's very comprehensive, and it really shows all the different things that could affect a well in one way or another. Heat exchangers, swimming pools, a lot of different things. Some are very obvious, animal or poultry building, and some maybe not so much so, but it just gives you an idea of what you need to be aware of and what things could contaminate a well. And, in a good case, a well may be several hundred feet deep with a screen at the bottom if it's sand and gravel, and what happens at the surface really isn't an issue as long as it's properly constructed and grouted so that surface water can't run in along the well casing. But in other cases where it may be a shallower well or it may be getting water from near the surface, a lot of these things will matter. And so it's understanding the well construction and what risks go along with that, as well as what potential vulnerabilities might be out there. I guess I went back to this just to show how some of those fit in. If it's a well point, for instance, or, are there other issues that are non-compliant according to the state of Wisconsin anyway. The third thing is test the water. And so there is really no alternative, in my opinion, to make an informed decision. You need to test the water. You need to understand what the water quality is. Maybe they don't have treatment. I know in my case, I grew up on this old dug well. My body was used to the bacteria, which we did have in our well, and all of the situation, the colonies that were there, if you will. But as soon as I went away to college, 6 months later, if I drank the water, it made me sick. And so I got used to city water that had been chlorinated and treated, and I lost that resistance in my stomach. And so it's important to test, because even if no one's gotten sick at the property, maybe that's because they've lived there a long time, and it doesn't mean that there's not a risk there. And so a couple other things that we've picked up reading some other materials, like test for chlorine when you do your test. Maybe they've just disinfected it so that it'll pass, but it has a recurring problem. And I've seen that happen before, where someone's had to chlorinate their well in their system 2 or 3 times in order to get it to not have a bacteria hit in the analysis, and then they put it on the market. And so in those cases, the right thing to do is to consider continual treatment if it's going to have a recurring bacterial problem. That means there's a pathway into the well that's either caused by poor construction at the surface or because it's close to some source like a septic system. And you see a lot of, especially springs in southern Illinois and Pennsylvania and Tennessee, where they have continual treatment, either chlorine or UV, on home systems just because of that issue. So what do you test for? You hear a lot of things, especially with Flint going on and all those things. There's a lot of different things you can test for. They all cost money. They all can be expensive. It really depends on the depth of the well, what kind of geology you have, and what known contaminants might be in an area. For instance, we know in Tazewell County, Illinois, the Mahomet Aquifer, a sand and gravel aquifer there, is prone to have arsenic. It's naturally occurring, and so the Tazewell County Health Department would tell a well owner, if they're considering sampling, be sure you test for arsenic, because we do have some of that in our county. But it behooves you not only to use, we're going to give you a list here in a second of what we think you need to test for, but also you should ask your county health department, are there any contaminants that have been identified in the area? Is there radium? I'll show some examples of some odd chemicals or odd constituents that are naturally occurring that if you're in that area you should test for. So your lender can also have requirements. I know you're all aware of this. There's a lot of issues related to HUD and FHA loans and what they need to test for. Their old rules said you had to test for everything that's an MCL, which is what the EPA requires for community water supplies. That can cost up to about $5,000. I know they've recently changed that a little bit, and they require fewer things. And so, but the important thing is to be informed again and understand what you need to test for, so you can not only to get it past the buying and selling phase, but so that whoever's living there can protect their family and their health and those sorts of things. So as far as natural groundwater quality, I mentioned arsenic. It's simple to find that out if you just do a little investigation. In Illinois, you call your Illinois Department of Public Health, your county health department. Your extension office might be aware as well at the county level. Also, your state geological survey or state water survey. We can tell you where there's certain chemicals or certain constituents that are naturally occurring in Illinois. And so there's both nuisance and health-based contaminants. The nuisance are called secondary. Those would be things like chloride, naturally occurring chloride. It doesn't taste great. It makes the water start tasting salty, but it isn't really a health risk, or iron. Or health-based contaminants like arsenic or lead or some of those things. There's info online available, and if you haven't searched, I certainly recommend everyone do that. Depending on what state you're in, there's a lot of information available. And you need to do that in advance so that you know what to include when you do a water sample, and you can include those constituents. So here's an example. Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection has this page where you just type in your address, and they'll tell you based on the sampling they've already done whether you're at risk for either uranium or arsenic contamination. So this is just one example of a way that they're trying to help well owners understand what their risks might be. They've got fact sheets available. They have a list of labs that can test for you. And again, you just type in your address, and it will give you that information. This is the state of Rhode Island, and hopefully you can see that big splotch in the middle as well as all the little dots. They put this up because two issues. The small little circles are all where they believe there may be arsenic contamination in the shallow aquifers because of orchards in the area, and the large splotch in the middle is actually beryllium. And until I found this page, I didn't realize beryllium was a regulated contaminant. It's not very common to find it, but there's a lot of it in Rhode Island. And if you live in those counties in that area where that splotch is, they recommend you test for beryllium as well, and it does cause health effects. So that's one reason why we talk about searching. This is a new site that the Department of Ecology in Washington State's put together. It lists a lot of sample results. You can look at these things and click on them. These are all the samples they have. You can zoom in. You can see what the water quality is. But it's an example of where things are going at the state level for water quality analysis and those sorts of things, and information you may be able to find. Even it may not be that property, but it may be nearby, and so it provides you some idea of what the natural groundwater quality might be. Again, here's one for Wisconsin that Stevens Point's put together on. They had different constituents. I've put up arsenic, and it shows you the county where they've had detects, or the average of the samples they've done meet those criteria. So here's what we suggest for sampling annually for coliform and nitrate, and the reason you sample for those annually, neither one necessarily could cause you immediate harm. Nitrate can cause a problem for babies, pregnant women, because of the transfer of, it converts to nitrite in your body and can disrupt the hemoglobin in your blood, replacing the oxygen. So it's called blue baby syndrome. But both of these things are typical in the environment, especially in farming areas for the nitrate. And so if you find them, it indicates that there might be a pathway into a well. And so you sample for those regularly because if there's a breach in your well, there's a crack in the casing, somebody's hit it with a mower, something's changing the well, it's just deteriorated. We see wells that over time, eventually they rust, or they somehow the joints come apart, and that may allow things to get in a well. And so it's a good way to cheaply determine if there might be a breach in your well. These other things that are listed here, we recommend sampling if you haven't sampled before, or if it's new to this person that might be buying a property, so that you have kind of a baseline to go by, especially for things like sulfate, pH, hardness, even arsenic and chloride. Some of those things should not change very much. We see over time arsenic, if it's naturally occurring in a well, in an aquifer, it's very similar at that location. And so if you have a huge change in TDS, total dissolved solids, or chloride, or some other value, it could indicate that something's happened to the well, or there's a different source, or there may be contamination somewhere that's making its way into your well. And so all of these things are just, every 3 to 5 years to kind of assure yourself that your well's still working properly, the aquifer still has the same water quality, and that sort of thing. And then, again, you should always seek advice from your local state health department on all these things, because there may be local constituents of concern. I mentioned radium, beryllium, things that you wouldn't normally test for that you're not going to know unless you ask. And I know there's a question about whether your health department can get your results and can do anything. A lot of people believe that if the health department sees your results, they can make you stop using the well if there's a problem. That's just absolutely not true in 99% of the cases. There are a few areas where that isn't the case, counties that may have passed ordinances. And I just found out today, talking to the Water Systems Council, about a county in New York where they expect you to add treatment or to mitigate the problem if you sample, and they require it now in that county. And if you do have a problem, that's a primary drinking water standard that's been, if the well's contaminated with that over the limit that the EPA set, they do expect you to add treatment or do something to make that go away. But that's a very unique case. In Illinois, if you get your well sampled, either by you ask the health department or have a private lab or whoever samples your well, the water survey samples, you can take that result to the health department and ask them to interpret it for you. Matter of fact, that's what we tell people and we recommend, because they're there to help you. They want to protect your health. They may say, this arsenic is 10 times the limit, and we do see that. We wouldn't recommend drinking this without treatment, but you may be 75 years old and drank this water for 40 years and say, I've drank this for 40 years and it hasn't affected me. We see that all the time too. People who are just sure that it's not going to affect them. And, there's no rhyme or reason for that. Some people are more susceptible to things than others. But, again, these limits are there for a reason, the primary drinking water standards, and they're there to protect public health. And even if it's okay for you, it may not be okay for kids or grandkids or whatever. And so we recommend that people certainly add treatment when they have those issues. So it's best to inform your client and be informed is the bottom line. And I know perspective is everything. If you're the seller versus the buyer, you have different, you're trying to get as much out of your property as you can versus, that sort of thing. But it's certainly better to make sure that both sides understand where they sit, what resources are there. And as far as this, consider a web page. It makes you look better if you are more informed and it's obvious to your client that you're informed. Again, we recommend if you take our class, I think we even have a lot of environmental health professionals, county sanitarians who work with wells who have taken our class and said that they really learned a lot. And so we've developed it so that it helps everyone be aware of what the issues are and what things could be a concern. And so we certainly recommend you take our class if you haven't, and that you insist on an inspection and sampling, even if it's not required. Just because the benefits far outweigh the cost of bad blood, bad recommendations. In some cases, like in Illinois, I'll show that we have a disclosure statement, you're legally liable. Even though there's no requirement for inspection or sampling, there are issues that can come back to haunt you. So this is just an example for the Illinois Department of Public Health, the type of resources they have available, accredited labs, the scientific surveys and the information they have, information about, there's a lot of different types of wells, all that sort of stuff. Here's another one. This is from Wisconsin, and help for property owners and inspectors. And then this is actually, the Looper team is a realtor in Colorado, and they've put together a page called their Homeowners Club, and they have a whole section about water. They found all these different videos. They give really basic information about how a well works and how it's drilled, and, construction issues and water issues in Colorado, where, out west in some of the western states, you have a lot more issues with water rights than we do here further east, but they all play into all of that. So that's my part of this presentation as far as what we wanted to get across today. And so we did receive a lot of questions. There were at least 50 as of yesterday from folks who'd signed up. And so we've went through and answered those that we can. We've got answers from other folks where we don't have the expertise. And so I guess it was of Monday. Yeah, we had 50 questions as of Monday. So we are developing a web page for frequently asked questions, and I mentioned this several months ago. We actually have a draft of it done. We just have to populate all of the questions. So we're working on that. I think it'll be available in 2 months or less. And there'll be a lot of the questions that have been asked. We're putting all that information in with the right answers so that people can search through there and get a lot of answers on their own. We've also received questions that are really outside of our expertise, or, from the standpoint of, I'm a groundwater hydrologist, Dan and Chuck are chemists, Katie's our outreach person, if you will, and support for a lot of the material we put together. And so some of the questions are about other topics, legal issues, things like that. We're not going to answer those today, nor, a few of them I included to make recommendations on what you need to do. But really we want to stick to things that are about protecting the well owner's health, drinking water, and how to maintain wells. So we're going to go through those, and I'm just going to get started. So what is the cost of well inspection? This is actually from the last presentation we did a few months ago, but I thought it relevant. So Katie did a lot of work looking at costs and drilling costs and a bunch of other things before, and I thought it appropriate to include some of this. Inspection can cost $200 to $600, and if you do a water sample, that's usually a separate cost. I know I mentioned New Jersey before. They have a law that's been on the books for about 15 years, maybe a little longer, that says the state lab will come out and collect a water sample at the transfer of every property, and it costs about $600. The buyer and the seller have to agree on who's going to pay for that. It's basically a research quality sample of the water at that location from that well. They get about 13,000 samples a year through that program. They don't share individual results with anyone but the buyer and seller. No one else can see that data except an aggregate where they've maybe mapped general trends in water quality by constituent and things like that. So what responsibilities does a realtor have if there's an old large diameter well on a property they are listing or showing? So this goes back to the questions I mentioned before about an old abandoned well. I would think in civil court, if you have an old well and somebody falls in or somebody gets hurt or dies, you're going to be liable regardless. But illegally, it depends on the state. Most states have laws that say that if you have an abandoned well, you have to seal it. The problem is, in most states, that's not enforced. I know that is a law in Illinois. It's rarely enforced just because there isn't the manpower at the county level to actually do that. But if you don't disclose that information, you're really providing a disservice to your client and everyone involved. And, down the road when something bad does happen because of that well, it's going to come back to hurt your credibility as well as possibly affect the seller. So, for instance, in Minnesota, you have to provide a diagram that shows every well. And in Illinois, there's a well disclosure legal document that the seller has to fill out, and it basically says, I think I might have a picture of it here down the road, I am aware of defects or unsafe conditions. So it says you have to say yes, no, or not applicable. I am aware of defects, material defects in my well or well casing. The next question is, I am aware of unsafe drinking water conditions for my well water. And the seller has to answer each of those questions, and they're legally liable if they falsify that document. What's a new well cost? Katie called all over the country. We said, a 300-foot bedrock well with steel casing that's 6 inches, including, the pressure tank and water lines and everything they need for a system. You can see the range of values. The folks she contacted in Michigan said that they put in PVC. If you wanted a steel well, it was going to be over $30K. but it certainly varies by state, and I think by how urban a state may be and the need. So it's just there's a wide range of values on cost for putting in a new well. There were several questions about backflow prevention, and so I contacted Mark Layton at Kickapoo Drilling, which is near here where I live in Downs, Illinois. Mark sits on a national work group I put together on developing an assessment tool, and during those discussions, assessment tool for evaluating vulnerability of private wells, this issue came up, and Mark was very knowledgeable about it, so that's why I contacted him. But if you have any kind of chemical injection for irrigation or anything else, sprinklers, whatever, then you need a reduced pressure zone valve, which basically prevents both water suction whenever you turn off the system, and also if there's a difference in pressure. So for instance, you shut off an irrigation system and it's at a higher elevation, then the pressure may be higher on the far end versus on the end where the potable water is, and it'll shut that off so that you're not having that water that may have a contaminant in it or a chemical of some sort going back through your system. Yard hydrants, like with a garden hose connection, should have a double check valve and should be considered non-potable. I know in Illinois, he said that they paint their hydrants yellow and they mark them as non-potable just because, around where the hose fitting is and some of those things, there's a lot of bacterial issues. There are vacuum breaker style yard hydrants and hydrants that you can install, but if you're in an area where it freezes, they found that those are not very practical. Matter of fact, he said that, well, it's the last bullet here, that a lot of times that and the canister type for potable water use, they have to be drained properly. And if they're not, then they'll bust, and the pipe will bust because it's still got water in it. And he said, I can't tell you how many of those I've had to replace because the owner forgot to drain the system before winter. So, and at least in Illinois, most of the backflow rules fall under the plumbing code. That's where you can find that information. That's not something that we deal with a lot, other than we recommend putting backflow prevention on systems. But for the details, probably a well driller or a plumbing contractor will have a lot more information and have a lot more experience. How do you find the plumbing for the leach beds if the previous owner installed it themselves? So in other words, someone installed their own septic system. Is the way I take this question. So we've had Ron Helton on our septic webinar we did last summer. He owns D&D Sewer Service in Lincoln, and he basically said that, well, one, assuming that they installed it meeting code, which, we find a lot of septic systems where there's just a straight pipe to a ditch, or it goes to a drain tile in a field rather than having a septic tank and being properly installed. It may have been done 40 years ago. In that case, there's no guarantee that it actually does meet code. But if you're looking for a system and you don't have any information about it, the best thing to do is use a probe. You can even buy these like at a Farm and Fleet or some farm and home type store. And it's just basically a steel rod, and you need to find where the line leaves your house. Then you can use the probe to follow it to the tank. Generally, the outflow for the tank is on the opposite side from the inflow, but probe around the tank until you find it. And then you can follow that to the manifold, which is the distribution box for all your laterals. And if it's a typical installation and it's all buried. And so here's an example of, on the left, the tank. There's an inlet pipe going into the tank and an outlet pipe that goes out towards your laterals. And then looking at the figure on the right, from the tank it goes to a distribution box, which is the manifold, the term he used. And that goes to a lateral system of perforated pipes that allow all of the septic discharge to slowly percolate into the ground, and natural bacteria breakdown and all that good stuff. So a probe's the best way to do that as far as trying to find it. And if you can't find it, then I'd certainly consider hiring a licensed septic installer inspector to come out and find it for you. That's their job. We had a question specific to Virginia. Is there a law that limits livestock distance from a well on an adjacent property? So this is a situation where the well is only 6 feet from the property line, and it wasn't clear to me. At some point they started putting livestock on the property adjacent to that, and now the cattle are, one of their favorite places to lay is 6 feet from the well. Not a necessarily good situation. Erin Lings is co-op extension at Virginia Tech, runs the Virginia Household Water Quality Program, and that's their URL. She suggested that, one, you should have the water tested if it hasn't been. And, they put on clinics all around the state that are free to well owners, or they also have a list of private labs. And there's a lot of resources on their website that you can use, as well as she is a wealth of information. She's been doing this for a long time. She understands, especially Virginia, what's going on. The other thing she recommended was contacting Dana Rivas at the Virginia Department of Health for clarification on what the regs actually say and how they mean, and that's that email address. And if you are the person who asked this and I'm going too fast, you can email me at our email address on privatewellclass.org, and I can get you this information, or forward Erin's email back to me to you that's more complete. But this is, Erin gave me this. Basically, any new construction since 1992 requires a sanitary survey. So there should be a sanitary survey associated with the well construction. The one problem is that there is no minimum separation distance from a property line, so that wouldn't have been an issue. It basically says that the owner is responsible to ensure that the well location will meet all the local ordinances. She provided this from their state law that shows the distance there needs to be depending on the type of well. And again, there's Erin's email address at the bottom if you have additional questions. But it really sounds like having it 6 feet from the property line, even if there weren't cattle there when it started, doesn't give you a lot of options. And again, Dana Rivas may be able to help in that situation. So is there an optimum time to sample, and can the season's weather affect results? Well, it really depends on the well and the water source. A deeper well, so for instance here in Champaign County, we have wells that are in a sand and gravel aquifer that are about 250 feet deep. There's 100 feet of clay over the aquifer, and so we don't see surface influence. It's really one of the places in the state where we don't even see nitrate over background levels, just because it's so protected, and for water to infiltrate into the aquifer there takes so long. So if it's a very deep well or it's a deeper well, it may not be influenced by any kind of surface event, flood or drought. But if it's shallower, then it's much more likely that those things do have an effect. You see a lot of hand-dug or bored wells go dry in a really severe drought. Even, I know there was a question about California, I'll get to in a minute. We've seen wells that are hundreds of feet deep in California go dry, and they've had to re-drill deeper wells. So it certainly does. Is there an optimum time? If a well gets flooded or overtopped with water, it's likely to be contaminated and it shouldn't be used until tested. But even if the surface water gets close to a well, then that can affect the water quality in a shallower well. And so I guess to answer the question, it certainly can. And is there an optimum time? I would say in general, not necessarily, but if there's any kind of significant event, like a drought or a flood, then you might want to do so. And Chuck had sent me an email. I was just going to let him respond. You on the line, Chuck?
Yes, I'm here.
I can barely hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Nope.
Okay. Let's see.
Well, I can, but it's very low.
Right.
Katie, can you hear me any better?
I can't really hear him very well. It's very faint.
Okay. What do I need to do?
Well, I know what Chuck sent me earlier was about some sampling they'd done, and when they saw the water levels dropping in some wells that had been during the drought, it changed especially some of the parameters, I think TDS maybe, and conductivity. And so I guess the point was just that those things can certainly have an effect. So sorry about that. How do you eliminate sulfur iron bacteria? The bottom line is once it gets in a well, it's really hard to eliminate, and generally you have to treat the water. Chlorination is common, and you might need continuous treatment if it won't go away. You can try shock chlorinating a well, but I guess what some of the information we've come across suggests that once it's there, it's hard to get it out. And some things like sulfur bacteria, or even iron bacteria, they're naturally occurring in an aquifer and may not it's not like it's a contaminant that just from well construction, though a lot of times that does happen too. And so, all you can do is try to kill them and with chlorination. And hopefully, if you follow the right steps for doing that, you've eliminated you can eliminate them, but it's unlikely. So, is lead found in well water? Well, lead can exist in well water. It is in the ground. We actually have a lead mine up by Galena, Illinois, I believe. And so it is in the geologic materials that may serve as an aquifer for your well. But most of the lead issues that we see in Flint and a lot of other areas, especially for community water supplies, it's because of lead plumbing and corrosive water. And so if you want to know if there's lead in your area or significant lead in the geologic materials, your county or regional health department should know, and your state geological survey should be able to tell you as well if there's a natural lead issue or if there's a lot of lead in the ground in a particular area, where it might be mined or that sort of thing. Lead plumbing, before 1980, a lot of homes were built with lead plumbing. Lead solder was allowed until 2014. And so it really comes down to whether your water is corrosive or not. What tends to happen is if you have lead pipes and the water isn't corrosive, then there's a layer that builds up on the pipes that protects so the water doesn't leach lead. And it's when things get more corrosive that layer doesn't exist and lead can be leached from pipes. And, we've only seen the tip of the iceberg, I think, on some of the communities that have issues with lead. I know there's just an article in the Chicago Tribune about some of the sampling the Chicago Health Department has done and some of the areas where now they're starting to see more lead, and whether it's attributed to old lead paint or the water from iron or from lead pipes is still to be determined. So it's best just to sample. If you do have it, then there are treatment options available, and to make sure that you're just being safe there. Rust color in water, and this is likely from iron, most likely, and it's either iron precipitating from the water, iron oxide, or it's from iron bacteria that can cause that orange-brown slime to build up on fixtures. Not no fixtures, but on fixtures and in devices in your home. If it's iron bacteria, then chlorinating the well might eliminate them and take care of that problem. If it's iron oxide, then what happens is iron exists in groundwater in solution. And when you bring it up and it gets exposed to air, it precipitates out as iron oxide. So in some cases, there can be so much iron. It's not iron bacteria. It's just iron precipitating and forming that reddish-brown scale that builds up inside of pipes. That one way to do that is to aerate it and give it air before it actually gets to the critical parts of your system. We've pulled casings for a pump. This is an industrial application where the casing, the standpipe for a pump was 12 inches in diameter that only had a 2-inch hole left in it, and all the rest of the pipe on the inside of the pipe was iron oxide that had basically almost sealed the pipe off. And so it's just because turbulent water causes air, and so it causes that iron to precipitate. And one of the things that you can do is to put a second tank in, actually before your current pressure tank on your system, that you can use as an aerator. And it would require then a pump between the first tank and the second tank to keep pressure in your bladder tank. But what it does is that you can aerate that water in advance, kind of a pre-treatment, if you will, to get all the iron out, a lot of the iron out of it, and then you're stuck with maintaining and cleaning that iron oxide out of that first tank. And a pump installer or a water well contractor can help you with that. And if you do have a lot of iron, then I'm sure they're aware of it in that area. It's pretty common where it happens. Usually it's not in one spot. It's pretty ubiquitous in an area. So probably a water well contractor is your best bet for figuring out the best system to use to eliminate that. So this is a question about, did wells in California dry up during the drought, and does drought affect water quality? As I said earlier, it certainly can affect water levels and therefore affect water quality. So in California, for instance, we've had people call us about their well going dry, and these are 200 or 300 feet wells. There's so little water replenished in the aquifers and so little recharge that there's folks who've had 200 or 300 foot wells who are drilling 500 foot wells now. And the worst part of it is the drillers are so busy, there might be a 6 month or year delay before a driller can get to your property to actually put in a deeper well. And so the other thing that causes, as water levels decline, you're exposing formation, geologic formation that may have never been exposed to air, and that can change the chemistry, just like the iron oxide issue. And so the bottom part here, so for some low yield wells, like in Pennsylvania that are in bedrock, they might be hundreds of feet deep and have 100 or 200 feet of water in them. But when you start pumping that, they draw down really quickly, and they may only supply 1 or 2 gallons a minute over a long term. And so when the water level drops at 100 feet, then that geologic material is exposed to air, and it can cause water chemistry changes. So it certainly does affect water quality, or it certainly can. It doesn't necessarily, going back to the sand and gravel well here in Champaign County, the drought of 2012, we saw a lot of dug and bored wells go dry where people had to haul water, and the water levels in the Muhammad Aquifer that are 250 feet below land surface where the water's coming from, we really saw no effect because of the drought. So, and it could be minor as far as water quality changes, or it could be significant. That's why you need to test. Our sampling results shared with local health departments or state agencies only when required. So I mentioned Westchester County and New York. They do require, it's only shared with the county, the lab that does the work, and the buyer and seller. They do require you to mitigate in that county, which is very unusual, but no one else sees the results, and they're kept confidential. In New Jersey and Oregon both, they require a water sample at the transfer of property, and in those cases, they share the results with the buyer and the seller. Whether you do anything with that is up to you. It doesn't have to be fixed. It doesn't have to be mitigated. They won't tell you can't drink the water. They won't tell you can't sell the property. And even in Westchester County, if the buyer and seller agree, you can still go ahead and sell the property without fixing it, as long as the buyer and seller sign an agreement saying that they will do so. So, and in Illinois, I bring this up just because your health department and your state agency are there to help you, and they're not there to try to say you can't use your well. So in Illinois, you can ask the county to sample your well, especially if you have some reason there was a spill or somebody got sick. They will sample your well, and they'll provide you the results, and they still won't tell you you can't use the well. They may recommend you don't use your well. You have arsenic at 200 ppb is a bad thing to find out when the standard is 10. But if you want to keep drinking it, that's up to you. So that's why it's buyer beware in all of this. And as a well owner, you're responsible for maintaining and protecting your family and maintaining your well. And that's the case in by far the majority of the country. Can a well owner retain water rights to a well when selling the property? I wasn't sure where this came from as far as, in Illinois we have very little water law. I'm sure if I was going to sell a property and still wanted to use my well, maybe I have adjoining property where I want to have access to it, I could write a legal agreement that would allow me to do that as long as the buyer was willing. But in other parts of the country, water rights are precious, in Washington State and out west, and you'd really have to talk to your state or local agencies or a legal professional to understand whether that's allowable, who retains the right. If I'm out in Washington and I'm buying a property that has a water right, I'm not interested in the property if I don't have the water right, would be my guess. So this is really not a question that we can answer, but that's the direction I'd go. Priority sampling for families with small children. If there's a health concern and you go to your health department and say, I've got small children, I'm worried that, they're getting sick because of this, they may be willing to do a sample even for free, but I know of no specific regulations or programs that are for testing just because you have small children, and you have to talk to your local health department or your state to see what might be available there, depending on where you're living. So what are your thoughts on water quantity testing? So this issue, just to frame it, there may be very little water available, like low-yielding wells in Pennsylvania, or we had a person who has a well on the western slope of the Rockies where their well's in granite and it pumps a half a gallon a minute. And so the issue becomes, it really depends on where you're at and what kind of situation you're in. And the reason this was asked, it's a community that's interested in maybe passing an ordinance that says you not only have to get a water quality sample taken, but you also have to get a water quantity test done to make sure that there's enough water for a family who might be buying a well or buying a property with a well. So, there's a lot of problems with this sort of thing. One, I mentioned earlier that in the drought of 2012, there were some wells that went dry in Illinois and they had to haul water. Now those wells are fine. The water tables come back. A lot of water levels have come back up. And so how do you predict that? How do you protect from that? How do you guarantee that someone's always going to have water? Water levels change throughout the year. You may be in a type of aquifer that's fine 9 months of the year, but you might have limited water availability 3 months of the year. Unless you're testing that regularly, how do you know that? And then there's areas, I mentioned this one on the western slope of the Rockies. They found a way to make it work. They put in a cistern. So their well basically pumps continuously a half a gallon a minute or a quarter gallon a minute, I can't remember which it is, into a cistern, and then they have a pump in their cistern that provides water to their house with pressure. And so by doing that, they're able to pump, several hundred gallons a day into their cistern, which is all they need, and they found a way to make it work. There's a place like that in Illinois. We ran across a bedrock well that's on the edge of a large sand and gravel aquifer. They're actually on the end of a subdivision. All the other 20 homes in that subdivision have sand and gravel wells. Where they drilled, the sand had ended, and so they were stuck with this well that only puts out maybe a gallon a minute. So their solution was to put in a storage tank in their basement, that 1,000-gallon tank, so it can pump during the night while they're sleeping, and then they have enough water at their high use times in the morning and in the evening for that. So, not setting a limit of, say, 3 gallons a minute may not work. It may not be necessary. And then who signs off on that? Are you going to get a hydrologist to say, yeah, there's enough water? And if there's work needed, who's going to pay for it? We have people all over the country who have to haul water all the time during dry times because they have these shallow bored or dug wells where the water table just isn't supportive. And, one of my suggestions would be maybe have a disclosure requirement like Illinois does related to that issue. How much water does your well pump? Have you ever had problems with enough supply at of your well? Something that would maybe provide some information, but not go to the point of saying, well, you have to have a test done that shows you have plenty of water. What's plenty is the bottom line. And here's the Illinois disclosure law or form. This actually was put together by the Illinois Association of Realtors, and they all use one form throughout the state, is my understanding. But it asks, I am aware of material defects in the plumbing. I am aware of material defects in the well or well equipment. I am aware of unsafe conditions in the drinking water. So I've told this story before, maybe not to this group. We were doing a bunch of sampling in a country subdivision where everybody had a private well. And I had one guy who said, you can sample my well for arsenic as long as you don't send me results and you do it when I'm not home. And it turned out he was selling his property, and he wanted to be able to answer this question honestly. So he didn't want to know if he had arsenic in his well because he didn't want to be able to have to say that he had unsafe conditions. Right or wrong, that's what he chose. And so you can see that the rest of this here, there's whether you have radon or whether your septic's correct. It's one way to get at, if the owner at least knows that there's issues, they're required by law to answer this honestly. And if they do lie or they do falsify this document, they're legally liable for not only getting it fixed, but also court costs and lawyers' fees and all those sorts of things. So, there are ways to ensure that everyone's on the same page and everything's done properly. Is it fair that you buy a property and you've lived there for 40 years and now all of a sudden you find out that there's really high arsenic there and now your property value's not what you think it should be? It's not. I agree. But the reality is it's something that everyone needs to be aware of, and the risk needs to be shared so that we're protecting public health. So a little bit about the private well class. And if you have questions, there's a question place on your GoToWebinar screen where you can type in questions. Katie's hopefully been gathering those as we go, or if you've been waiting, might be a good time to pose those questions. It's a series of 10 lessons. If you go to privatewellclass.org, I'll show you the front page in a second. There's the webinars that we do not only for realtors and environmental health professionals, but we also do a series for well owners themselves. But the flagship part of this class is really the 10 lessons that we do. They're self-paced. They're sent to you once a week over 10 weeks, each lesson, and they create a more informed well owner is the idea. But we found that there's a lot of professionals, realtors, environmental health professionals, others who also have taken our class and find it useful. So here's some of the things that are covered in the 10 lessons, all the way from how water flows into the well and the hydrologic cycle to where you should locate your well and what to do if you have a contaminant, different types of treatment, how contaminants get into your well and in groundwater, a lot of issues. And so it's really helpful to understand, for instance, the difference between a bedrock well and a sand and gravel well and a dug and bored well and where the water's coming from, who to ask questions to. There's a whole lesson that's just on those issues, how to find local help, and that sort of thing. This is our front page. On the lower left is Learn by Email. Click on that, and it takes you to a page where you can sign up. That's what this is. All we ask for is an email address, your first name, and where you live. And really the where you live is by state, and that's so that we can, our funder is the US EPA, and they want to make sure that what we're doing is actually nationwide, and we're supporting well owners all over the country. So, and as a professional, there's an outreach partnership available just where we provide information on a newsletter that has other information in it. One more thing about the class, I wrote the lessons, and I'm not necessarily good at that. So we provide a lot of background information for each lesson that you can click on any of these and get to resources that other people have put together, so that if maybe it wasn't clear, the concept wasn't clear by what I wrote, you can look at some of these other materials and maybe get a better perspective. We have videos, simple things like, what, they're 3 to 5 minutes long, what's an aquifer, what's an artesian well, what can I do after a fire that affected my well. We also record every one of our webinars. This one's being recorded. It'll be up on our webpage here by next Monday, as I mentioned earlier. And so as far as partners go, we have an outreach partner program basically, and it's just, we have a blog and a newsletter that goes out once a month with additional resources. And so it's a way, as a professional, you can get extra information or more information, learn about our webinars or other things we might be doing, and ask these questions. So here's, for instance, our February newsletter. We just started this in January. Katie actually does all these. And we were working with NEHA, the National Environmental Health Association, and we actually put a version of our class up on their website. And so sanitarians can take those 10 lessons and actually get continuing education credit for it. And the same with home inspectors. Well, we've had one of the 2 national accrediting home inspector associations contact us, and they're actually going through these lessons now to determine what they might be worth for home inspectors for credit. But they're probably going to use NEHA's website to send people to, as far as getting the lessons and going through them and taking the quizzes at the end, so that there's continuing education credit for home inspectors as well. So pretty useful stuff. And as far as realtors, we're creating a landing page. It's not up yet, but it will be soon. We plan to do this webinar over again and answer, certainly the questions will be different, if not the other material. And then again, our partner page and partner newsletter. Some of the questions that were asked about the underwriters and what they require or what state requirements there are, we're putting that together, Katie is, and we'll have that in our FAQ when it's available. We also work closely with some of the other national organizations, the Water Systems Council, which I mentioned earlier, and they have a lot of resources, as does the National Groundwater Association. And so I encourage you to look at those places as well. And yeah. So the overall goal of all this and why we started this class is to help well owners understand why their well is important, why they need to understand how it works, and how to protect themselves from risk and to protect their family's public health. And that should be all of our goals. It's not just for the well owner who takes our class, but also for those that are serving them. If everyone's doing their job and has their buyer or seller's best interest at hand, then it certainly behooves you to be prepared for this. So I know it's already almost an hour and a half, but yeah, so if you have comments, again, on how to make this webinar better, we would certainly appreciate that. we're going to take a few minute break so I can look at the questions, or we can look at the questions, and then we'll answer any of the questions that you've asked us to this point. So if you'll hang on a few minutes, it'll probably be less than 5 minutes, but I'll pull those up in a minute and so we can all see them, and we'll be right back. Everybody see those okay?
Looks good to me, Steve.
All right. So how can a homeowner do maintenance on their well and pump? Typically, routine maintenance, we have best practices in our class lessons, but they're really about inspecting your well, making sure that things are, that there's no breach at the surface, that the well cap is maintained the way it's supposed to be, some of those things. I don't know, there's certainly a few well owners out there who can take care of their own well and pump, but it's probably best for most people, certainly, to have a contractor do that for them. And, I'm not trying to support contractors necessarily. It's just a lot of times, you can, it's why people don't change their own oil. Few people can change their own oil in their car, but most people go somewhere to do it just because, you don't cross-thread the things or, do things that might cause more of a problem. And so, I guess it depends on what kind of maintenance you're talking about. But, yeah, pumps should last a long time. And, as far as maintenance on the well, it's really about protecting it and making sure that there's no breach to get in the well and those sorts of things. That's not a very good answer, but that's the one I have. Anybody got anything to add?
Steve, I don't hear a lot of people discussing maintenance. I think a lot of people don't really do a lot of their own maintenance unless they have a problem.
Sure.
But I don't know about the whole country, but.
Well, and just so you know, you guys, so Dan Webb runs our public service lab, so well owners contact him. He sends them sampling kits, and in Illinois, a well owner can get their water tested through our lab. And Chuck Curtis is also on here. He's with our institutional water treatment program. He samples at all the institutions and facilities that Illinois has around the state. They're both chemists and very knowledgeable. Dan's actually a well owner himself, and so that certainly helps with what we're doing here. So, yeah, I would say, there's not a lot of maintenance that needs to be done just to make sure that, if there's something that goes wrong or if you notice something different, it's about making sure the well's protected and there aren't things around your well, that are going to cause a problem and that sort of thing. They're meant to last. So, and as far as which testing to be done for drinking water, we went through that, what we recommend, and really it's two things. It's the list I provided is what we would recommend as a bare minimum, so to speak. And then also contacting either your county health department or regional health department or the state and find out if there are any local contaminants of concern that need to be checked, as like arsenic or radium and that sort of thing. So, yeah, I went through that during the lesson. So I see sometimes the sanitary seal is broken. Can the owner replace it by themselves? The sanitary seal on the well cap, I guess, is what you're talking about. That should be sealed properly. I'm sure you can replace that by yourself. One of the things we do, we measure water levels in wells, and we certainly take caps off to do that. And we're just really careful when we disinfect our equipment. And so, it depends on the type of cap. The ones that I'm used to are kind of like I showed earlier, one of the red monitor caps, what I call it, with that type of cap on it. They have a vent tube that screws on the top, and in that case, usually you don't have to take the bolts off, but there are 5 bolts that hold the top to the bottom of that. And, yeah, again, if you're not sure, then I would have, at least the first time, have a contractor show you what to do. And it's worth the money to make sure you're doing things safely. Okay. And I'll leave this for Dan or Chuck. Is copper an issue?
I
Go ahead, Chuck.
usually don't see copper as being an issue, but one occasion I remember they had put in new copper pipe, but the building wasn't online yet, so there was very little flow, And so I'm assuming the copper pipe was shiny and hadn't gotten that copper oxide film on it. And they had extremely high levels of copper because there was very little flow, and the copper oxide layer had not formed yet. So if you're in a specific thing, and maybe you're put in new copper pipe and the water sat there for a while, you want to be sure and flush it.
Yeah, Chuck makes a good point about flushing the water if there is a concern. The same thing would go for lead. The biggest thing, as Steve mentioned before, the biggest concern is the water sitting around in the pipes, like if it sits overnight. If you regularly flush your water, there shouldn't generally be a huge buildup unless your water is really corrosive. Keep in mind for copper that the level is 1,300 parts per billion as opposed to lead's 15 parts per billion, so it's a much higher level, much higher tolerance for copper that's allowed in the water. But there still is a level. I don't know how common. It doesn't. In some of the work we've tested, we do see copper, but I'm trying to think if I've even seen it above the level recently. But I'm sure it does happen. But
well, and it's the same thing. It's a risk, especially with corrosive water. So, if the water's corrosive, eventually pipes will start pitting. You'll have copper get in solution in the water. There was just a case of a community with a new subdivision where they were doing something wrong with their treatment, and it caused all these copper pipes to start busting and pinhole leaks and that sort of thing. So it certainly can be an issue. It's not as, significant as what the lead issue is, just because of the health risk, I would say. There are areas where the water's corrosive enough that, you shouldn't put in copper or lead pipes. I mean, it should be PVC, just because you're going to have problems. So it's really a water quality issue, and what the natural water quality or the water quality going through the pipes, and how that might affect it. So, and Dan, you can probably answer the last question.
So what about putting a filter in? We do get a lot of calls about iron, sand, silt. A good thing to do for all well owners, I think, is to put it's cheap. They're like $5 or less to replace just a sediment filter. You might talk to people in your area and see what micron size. The one I use is a 5 micron, but the smaller size you go to, the more likely it'll clog up, but it'll also take more out of your water. So it's a really easy solution, inline filter, about a foot long and really cheap to do. It protects your equipment, and it'll also take another option. If you have iron starting to precipitate out, it'll help take that out. And then if you have a softener, the softener, it'll help protect that, and the softener may take out further iron or other things. But anyway.
All right. Thanks. I think that's all we have for today. Appreciate everyone who stuck around. And if you have any other questions, you can reach us at info@privatewellclass.org and just send us an email. There's also a phone number on our webpage at the bottom. Again, we're particularly looking for things that that you would like to see in this webinar for realtors that we haven't provided, or things that we can put on our webpage that might be a benefit to you. And, if there's a way to do that, we certainly will. So with that, thank you again, and I hope you enjoyed our webinar.